Good morning, church. Today is Tuesday. I believe it's March 15th. That does appear to be correct. This is Tyler, and I welcome you again to this new video in our series of Lenten reflections. You can see that I'm here in the sanctuary this morning, where we just wrapped up chapel for some of the children at our preschool, my friend's house here at the church. And I don't know, doing chapel with the little kids on Tuesdays has become one of the strange highlights of my week. And so I wanted to just spend a little bit more time here in this space this morning, in this place where all of these little children were just laughing and hugging and dancing and singing and praying. I think space is really powerful and important, and I just wanted to bask in that presence a little bit longer. So thank you for joining me here in the sanctuary. And let's do a hard segue and go ahead and get into today's reflection. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do a reading from Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verses 1 through 8. If you want to follow along, I'll be reading in the New International Version because that is the Bible that happened to be in my backpack this morning. So what we'll do, I will read that scripture without really talking about it. And then we'll take just a moment to unpack it because it's a scripture that I find both comforting and challenging, and I think sometimes it's really important for us as people of faith to sit in the tension of those places that are both comforting and challenging. And so I'll go ahead and read that now. If you want to take a moment of silence to prepare your heart, your mind, your spirit to hear this word from God this morning. There is a time for everything and a season for every activity under the heavens. A time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to uproot. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to tear down and a time to build. A time to weep and a time to laugh. A time to mourn and a time to dance. A time to scatter stones and a time to gather them. A time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. A time to search and a time to give up. A time to keep and a time to throw away. A time to tear and a time to mend. A time to be silent and a time to speak. A time to love and a time to hate. A time for war and a time for peace. These are holy words for holy people. Thanks be to God. Like I said, I struggle with the scripture. I find it both challenging and comforting. I find it challenging not only in some of the seasons that it names, which we'll get to in a second, but I also find it challenging sometimes in the way that it seeks to break our lives into these artificial delineations, right? Our lives don't occur in these clean-cut seasons where we can clearly identify this is what's happening now and this is what's going to happen later. Our messy human lives tend to happen where our seasons topple into and onto and through one another. Our time to laugh can also be our time to mourn, and our time to dance can also be our time to heal. Our time to weep can be our time to build. Our time to tear down can also be our time to embrace. Nevertheless, I think that we as humans sometimes seek boundaries. We seek clear abilities to name things. And I think there can be some comfort in that, but what I think is almost more powerful that I do find comforting about this scripture is that when you break our lives into these various times and seasons, I think it honors something really, really true to what it means to be human, which is when you're feeling something profound, whether it's a joyous emotion or if it's a grief or a mourning, whatever season that you're in, sometimes we can be in these seasons that totally overtake our lives and feel like they're the only things happening. And when that's happening, I think it's really, really helpful to have a scripture that names that and that gives us hope to remember that another time is coming. And so somewhere in the scripture, I wrestle with those two truths. And yet I find myself reading it every couple of months and coming back to it and reading it almost as a prayer and asking myself, what season of life am I in now? What is it that God is calling me to plant, and what is it that God is calling me to tear up? Where should I be mourning, and where should I be dancing? And every time I do that, I still struggle with certain seasons that are named in here. I struggle that it tells us that there's a time to kill and a time to heal. I think about everything happening in Ukraine right now, and I struggle with the idea that there is a time for war and a time for peace. And to be honest, I even push back against that. I don't think I fully agree with that statement. And I'm not saying that as Tyler Steele, guy employed by a church, and I'm not saying that as a representative of Methodist faith or Christian faith. That's just me as a human who lives with and wrestles with the scripture. Because I think sometimes it's really, really profoundly important that we name the things that we really struggle with and disagree with too, that we find stronger faith in naming and expressing and exploring our doubts. And so I do that if only to encourage you to know that that same avenue is open to you as well. So what I'd like to do now is read the scripture one more time. And as I read it, I really want us to be in prayer and thinking about what season of life are you in right now. Again, where is God calling you to plant, and where is God calling you to pull things up by their roots? So let's take a moment to hear that scripture now. There is a time for everything and a season for every activity under the heavens. A time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to uproot. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to tear down and a time to build. A time to weep and a time to laugh. A time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather them, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to search and a time to give up, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to mend, a time to be silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. Holy wisdom, holy words. Thanks be to God. Friends, I invite you to sit with and wrestle with this scripture this morning, to see what God says to you in these words, to hear where God is calling you to move and to be. Sometimes where God is just calling you to sit and to rest. I hope that it's fruitful for you. We'll see you tomorrow.